It was September 4th, 1998, in a small Midwestern town where time seemed to move a little slower. Neighbors knew one another by name. The local grocery store closed before 9 p.m., and most evenings passed in quiet predictability. But that Friday night would shatter the sense of safety the neighborhood had carried for decades. At 7:15 p.m., 68-year-old Margaret Collins, known to everyone simply as Mrs. Collins, stepped out of her modest brick home on Sycamore Street. She carried with her a worn canvas shopping bag and told her daughter, who lived with her, that she'd be back within the hour. Margaret's plan was simple: to walk 2 blocks to the corner store and pick up bread, milk, and a pack of her favorite tea. She had done it countless times before. The streets were calm as she left. A lingering late summer warmth hung in the air, and porch lights flickered on one by one as the sun began its slow descent. Several neighbors recalled seeing her, her petite frame, her gray cardigan draped neatly over her shoulders, and the steady rhythm of her steps. She waved politely at a couple walking their dog and exchanged a few words with Mr. Reynolds, the retired mailman who lived across the street. Everything seemed routine, almost painfully ordinary. But routine can be deceptive, because sometime between her front porch and the glowing storefront at the corner, Margaret Collins vanished. When her daughter glanced at the clock a little after 9 p.m. and realized Margaret hadn't returned, the first ripple of unease spread. At first, she told herself not to worry. Perhaps her mother had run into a friend and decided to chat. Maybe the line at the store was unusually long. Yet, as the minutes stretched into hours, the rational explanations began to wither. By midnight, unease had hardened into fear. The local police were contacted shortly after 1 a.m. Officers canvassed the area, shining flashlights down quiet streets and into alleyways, retracing the familiar path from her home to the store. The store clerk confirmed that Margaret had never arrived that evening. She had simply disappeared somewhere along the short, well-lit route. Her family refused to sleep that night. Windows were left open in case she returned and called out. The porch light burned until dawn. But as the sun rose on September 5th, Margaret Collins was nowhere to be found. The town awoke to the news with disbelief. This was not a dangerous neighborhood, not a place where people simply disappeared. Margaret was not the type to wander or get lost. She had lived in the same home for over 40 years, walked the same sidewalks nearly every day, and was in good health despite her age. There was no reason, no logic, to explain why she never made it back. Rumors began to circulate almost immediately. Some whispered about strangers seen loitering near the park. Others spoke of a dark-colored car idling near the intersection that night. Yet nothing could be confirmed, and no trace of Margaret, not her shopping bag, not her cardigan, not even a set of footprints, was ever found. By the end of that week, fear had gripped the community. Doors that were once left unlocked were now bolted shut. Porch lights stayed on long into the night, and neighbors who once stopped to chat on the sidewalks now walked briskly, avoiding eye contact, as if silence itself might keep them safe. For Margaret's daughter, every sound outside became a potential sign, every knock on the door a surge of desperate hope. But each day ended the same way, with silence, with absence, with a gnawing sense that something unspeakable had happened in the span of just a few blocks. It was the beginning of a mystery that would stretch across more than a decade, a story that would haunt Sycamore Street for years to come. Because while the town carried on, the truth about Margaret Collins was hidden closer than anyone could imagine, waiting, sealed away, beneath the floorboards of a neighbor's basement. The morning after Margaret Collins disappeared, the quiet town of Westbridge shifted into a state of alarm. Word traveled quickly. The elderly woman who had never missed a routine, who always greeted neighbors with a smile, had failed to return home. In a community where even the smallest disruption felt like a tremor, This was a full-scale earthquake. Local police organized a search almost immediately. Volunteers gathered at the Collins home, forming lines to comb through nearby parks, fields, and wooded areas. Flashlights swept across ditches and culverts, and voices called her name into the empty night air. Margaret had been a familiar face in Westbridge for decades, and the outpouring of help spoke to just how deeply she was woven into the fabric of the town. But even as neighbors searched tirelessly, unease grew. The route from her home to the grocery store was short, less than a 5-minute walk. It was well lit, bordered by houses on both sides, and visible from several porches. How could someone vanish in such a space without anyone seeing or hearing a thing? Detectives interviewed witnesses one by one. Mr. Reynolds, the retired mailman, confirmed he had spoken to Margaret around 7:20 p.m. She was cheerful, carrying her shopping bag, and nothing appeared out of the ordinary. A young couple walking their Labrador reported seeing her wave at them just minutes later. And then, nothing. She seemed to dissolve into the night air between one street corner and the next. Flyers with her photograph were printed and taped to street lamps, telephone poles, and the grocery store window. Local news outlets picked up the story, urging anyone with information to come forward. Calls trickled in. A woman swore she saw someone matching Margaret's description at a bus stop on the far side of town. A man claimed he spotted her near the riverbank just after dusk. Yet each lead crumbled under scrutiny, leaving investigators with nothing but dead ends. Her daughter, Elaine, barely left the house during those first weeks. She sat by the phone, clutching a notepad, where she wrote down every possible clue, every name, every number the police mentioned. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by jolts of hope each time the phone rang. But the calls were never what she wanted to hear. Police expanded the search, bringing in dogs to sweep the area. For a brief moment, it seemed promising. The dogs picked up a scent trail that led down Sycamore Street and into an alley behind the grocery store. But there it stopped, abruptly and inexplicably, as if Margaret had vanished into thin air. In the absence of evidence, speculation filled the void. Some whispered that she might have suffered sudden memory loss and wandered away. Others suggested a more sinister explanation, a kidnapping, perhaps by someone who had been watching her routine for weeks. With no clues, the line between rumor and fact blurred, and the town spiraled deeper into unease. As weeks turned into months, the posters faded and peeled from telephone poles. The nightly search parties dwindled, replaced by a quiet, unspoken acceptance that Margaret might never be found. For the Collins family, however, there was no closure, only a wound that refused to heal. Elaine continued to keep her mother's room exactly as it was the night she left, the cardigan draped over the chair, the teacup on the counter, as if preserving those small details could somehow hold back the tide of absence. The case grew colder with each passing season. Detectives rotated in and out, each promising to find new angles, each leaving with the same result. Nothing. By the 5th year, Margaret Collins' disappearance had become less a case and more a haunting memory. New families moved into the neighborhood, unaware of the shadow that lingered over Sycamore Street. For those who remembered, the silence was worse than answers. But behind closed doors, Margaret's daughter refused to let go. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, she lit a candle in the window, hoping that somehow, somewhere, her mother might still see the light and find her way home. What no one in Westbridge could have imagined was that Margaret never left the neighborhood at all. Her final resting place was within walking distance of her own front door, hidden just a few feet away, in the basement of a house everyone thought they knew. By the early 2000s, Margaret Collins' disappearance had faded from the headlines, but for her family, it never left the walls of their home. Elaine still lived in the small brick house on Sycamore Street, surrounded by reminders of her mother's absence. every creak of the front steps, every rustle of the wind against the windows, carried with it a painful echo of the night Margaret never returned. Life in Westbridge marched on. Children grew into teenagers, houses changed hands, and new families moved into the neighborhood unaware of the ghost story their street carried. But for those who remembered, Margaret's face remained etched into their memories, the kind of image you see when you close your eyes at night. Police files on the case grew thicker, stacked with reports, interviews, and dead-end leads. Every so often, a new detective would take interest, flipping through the aging folders in hopes of uncovering something overlooked. But the facts never changed. Margaret was last seen walking toward the corner store. She never arrived. No one saw her leave town, and no evidence suggested she had done so willingly. Rumors lingered. Some said she had been abducted by someone just passing through. Others believed she might have suffered a medical emergency and collapsed somewhere unseen. But without evidence, each theory was just another thread, lost in a growing web of speculation. Elaine tried everything she could. She contacted private investigators, wrote letters to state agencies, and even appeared on local television to keep her mother's case alive. For a brief period, those efforts brought attention back to the story. Tips came in. A woman in another state thought she had seen Margaret at a rest stop. A man swore he recognized her from a bus station. Each possibility carried a flicker of hope, only to collapse under investigation. Year after year, the hope eroded. Holidays became heavier. Birthdays were reminders not of celebration, but of loss. Elaine would set a plate at the table every Thanksgiving, a silent gesture for the person missing from their lives. Friends urged her to move on, to accept what seemed inevitable, but she couldn't. Something in her refused to let go, as if surrendering hope meant betraying her mother. Meanwhile, the town itself changed. The corner store where Margaret was headed that night eventually closed, its windows boarded up and sign removed. To new residents, it was just another empty building. But for Elaine, it remained a monument, the place her mother had never reached. Each time she walked past it, she felt an almost physical weight pressing against her chest. By the 10th year, Margaret Collins's disappearance was considered a cold case. Detectives admitted privately that unless new evidence surfaced, there would likely never be answers. Elaine knew this, but she never stopped looking for patterns in the silence. She clipped every newspaper article about missing people, every report that bore even a faint resemblance to her mother's story. She kept them in a box under her bed, her private archive of unanswered questions. It wasn't until the 12th year that the silence finally cracked, not with a confession, not with a sudden tip from a stranger, but with a discovery that no one in Westbridge could have imagined. In the fall of 2010, a young couple purchased the old 2-story house at the end of Sycamore Street, just 4 doors down from Margaret's home. It had stood empty for nearly a year after the previous owner passed away. To the couple, it was simply a fixer-upper, a chance to start their lives together. They began cleaning, painting, and hauling away decades of clutter. One afternoon, while pulling up damaged floorboards in the basement, they found something they could not comprehend. Beneath the boards, wrapped in layers of rotting cloth and hidden behind a crudely built false wall, lay human remains, fragile bones, fragments of fabric, and within the debris, a set of wire-rimmed glasses that neighbors immediately recognized. The search for Margaret Collins had ended not in another state, not in some distant field, but just a few doors away from where she had lived her entire life. The discovery in the basement of the Sycamore Street house shook Westbridge in a way no one thought possible. For 12 years, Margaret Collins had been the subject of whispered speculation, of fading posters and unanswered prayers. And now, here she was, hidden not in some distant field or riverbank, but just a few doors down, beneath the feet of neighbors who had walked past the house every single day. The couple who found her remains were renovating the property, tearing out old flooring in the basement when they noticed something strange. Beneath warped boards and cracked concrete was a narrow cavity that didn't appear on the blueprints. Curious, they pried away more of the boards, only to uncover layers of cloth and wood shavings packed into the hollow space. At first, they assumed it was just forgotten insulation or debris. But then came the smell, faint but unmistakable, and a glimpse of something pale and fragile beneath the dust. Police were called immediately. The basement was cordoned off, and soon the once quiet street filled with squad cars, flashing lights, and reporters pressing against barricades. Neighbors stood in disbelief as investigators carried evidence bags up the narrow basement stairs. Many had lived on Sycamore Street for decades, watching Margaret's absence hang over the town like a shadow. Now they watched her return, in the most haunting way imaginable. Forensic teams worked for hours in the basement. Photographs were taken, samples collected, every inch of the space documented. Behind the false wall, they found what was left of Margaret. Time had stripped away flesh, leaving skeletal remains wrapped in remnants of clothing. A pair of wire-rimmed glasses, still intact, glimmered under the flashlight beams, the same kind she had worn every day of her life. The scene raised more questions than it answered. How had she ended up here? Who had placed her in the basement, sealed behind a wall? And how could it have gone unnoticed for over a decade? Detectives interviewed the former owner of the house, an elderly man who had lived alone until his death the previous year. His name was familiar to many in town, though few had ever spoken to him at length. Neighbors described him as reclusive, polite, but distant. He rarely entertained visitors, and most people recalled him keeping to himself. He had never been considered a suspect during the original investigation. As police pieced together the timeline, disturbing patterns emerged. The man's property had always been just outside the initial search radius back in 1998. At the time, investigators had focused on wooded areas, rivers, and fields, assuming Margaret might have collapsed or been abducted. Few considered the possibility that she had been hidden within a neighbor's basement all along. The false wall that concealed her remains had been built with crude lumber and nails, a quick construction meant to deceive, not to last. Yet it had done its job. No one suspected a thing. Over the years, while neighbors gathered for barbecues and children played in the yards, Margaret's body lay sealed in silence, mere steps away. For Elaine, the discovery was both relief and devastation. She finally had answers, but they came at a crushing cost. Standing outside the barricades, watching officers carry away the remains of her mother, she told reporters that at least the waiting was over. "She's coming home," Elaine whispered, clutching her daughter's hand. "Finally, she's coming home." But even as the town processed the shock, detectives knew the hardest part was still ahead. Margaret Collins had been found, but justice had not. And now, after 12 long years, investigators faced a chilling new question. Had the man who once lived in that house taken her life? And if so, why had no one ever suspected him? The answers would reveal not only the fate of Margaret Collins, but also the unsettling reality of how close danger can sometimes hide in plain sight. In the weeks following the discovery in the basement, Westbridge was no longer the quiet town it had once been. Satellite vans lined the streets, reporters crowded sidewalks, and neighbors who had long avoided speaking to the press suddenly found themselves recalling every detail about the man who had lived in that house. For the first time in over a decade, Margaret Collins' name was on everyone's lips again. Detectives began the painstaking process of reconstructing the final hours of Margaret's life. Forensic evidence confirmed what many feared. Her death had not been natural. The fractures on her bones, the position in which she was found, and the concealed space behind the false wall all pointed to deliberate foul play. The reclusive neighbor who had lived there became the focus of the investigation, though he himself had passed away the year before. Interviews painted a troubling picture. Former co-workers described him as quiet, meticulous, and prone to sudden bursts of anger. Neighbors recalled odd habits. He worked late into the night in his basement, never allowed repairmen inside, and once refused to let children retrieve a lost ball that had rolled into his yard. Alone, none of these details seemed damning. Together, in light of the discovery, they cast a chilling shadow. Theories swirled. Some believed Margaret may have encountered him on her way to the store that night, perhaps lured inside under some pretense, perhaps forced. Others wondered if she had known something about him, a secret he wanted to keep buried. But the truth of what happened in those final moments remained locked away, silenced forever by the walls that hid her. For Elaine, answers remained partial. She knew where her mother had been, but not why. She had confirmation that Margaret's disappearance was not a voluntary act, but she would never hear the reason behind it, never see a trial, never hear a confession. That absence of closure was its own kind of torment. "We waited 12 years, she told reporters softly, "and we'll wait the rest of our lives for the truth." The town struggled with its own guilt. How had no one suspected? How had Margaret's absence become just another headline that faded into the background? The boarded-up corner store, the neglected flyers, the whispered rumors, all of it seemed to symbolize not just the loss of one woman, but the failure of an entire community to see what had been right in front of them. In time, Margaret was laid to rest. Friends and family gathered in the small church at the center of Westbridge, the same one where she had sung in the choir for decades. Her daughter, Elaine, stood at the front, thanking the community for finally bringing her mother home. Many who attended had known Margaret personally. Others came because they felt they owed her a farewell that had been denied for far too long. The basement on Sycamore Street was sealed off. The house eventually sold again, though few could look at it without shuddering. For Westbridge, it became a lasting reminder of the fragility of safety, of how even in the most ordinary neighborhoods, darkness can hide behind locked doors and drawn curtains. Margaret Collins' story remains a warning, not just about one woman's disappearance, but about how easily silence can bury the truth. 12 years of unanswered questions had ended in a single basement, and yet, in another sense, the questions will never end. For Elaine, every memory of her mother is both comfort and wound. And for the rest of us, the story of Margaret Collins lingers as a haunting reminder. Sometimes, the greatest mysteries are not distant, not hidden in wilderness or faraway cities. Sometimes, they live right next door,